NTHE, first thing I heard, wasn't a cry, but a gasp. A tiny, shocked intake of air, as if the world was too bright, too cold. Then another and another. A chorus of 9 tiny gasps that should have been the most beautiful symphony on earth. They were my miracles, all 9 of them, born right here on the worn linoleum floor of our kitchen, my body tearing itself apart to bring them into the world. I was lying in a ruin of my own making, a tangle of life and the terrifying, metallic scent of blood. The world was a dizzying blur of pain and a fierce, primal love that threatened to swallow me whole. Through the haze, I saw him, my husband, David. He wasn't rushing to my side. He wasn't calling for help. He was standing by the back door, his hand on the knob, his face a mask of utter horror. He looked at the tiny, squirming bodies, then at me, his eyes filled with a revulsion so profound it felt like a physical blow. "David, please," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. "Help me. Help them." NHE didn't seem to hear me. He just kept counting, his lips moving silently. When he reached the last one, a low, guttural sound escaped his throat. It wasn't a word. It was a sound of pure despair, of a dream being crushed into dust. And 9, he finally choked out, the word dripping with venom. "All of them. Boys." Then he looked directly at me, his eyes cold and dead. "You did this," he hissed. "You've cursed me." NHE opened the door, and the cold night air rushed in, a cruel shock against my newborn son's fragile skin. He didn't look back. He didn't hesitate. He just walked out, leaving me bleeding on the floor, surrounded by our 9 sons, the future he had so desperately craved, now a nightmare he was running from. The click of the door latch was the sound of my world ending. In that moment, as the life drained out of me and my sons, cries began to weaken. I made a promise to whatever power was listening. If I survived this, he would learn what a curse truly was. NIF, your heart is already racing. You know what to do. Hit that like button and subscribe, because you won't believe what happens when a mother's love turns into a woman's fury. This is just the beginning. And David didn't just want a family, he wanted a dynasty. That was the word he used, always with a self-satisfied smirk, as if he were a king planning his succession instead of a mid-level investment banker from the suburbs. I met him at a charity gala, a world of glittering chandeliers and fake smiles I had stumbled into as a favor for a friend. I was a quiet art teacher, more comfortable with clay and paint-stained fingers than champagne flutes. David was a force of nature. He was handsome, charismatic, and radiated an ambition so intense it was almost a physical heat. He pursued me with a single-minded focus that I mistook for passion. He saw me, he said, and knew I was the one, the mother of his children. NHI's obsession with legacy was rooted in his own family. He was the only son of a man who had built a small empire in real estate, a patriarch who ruled his family with an iron fist and an open checkbook. David's father had 3 daughters before David was born, and he never let them forget they were disappointments. They were the practice runs. He'd joke at family dinners, a cruel jest that made everyone but David flinch. David, however, soaked it in. He internalized the belief that a man's worth was measured by the daughters he produced. Daughters were a sign of weakness, a failure to pass on the strength of his name. A man needed daughters to secure his legacy, to carry on the family name and, more importantly, the family fortune. When we got married, it was a lavish affair, more a business merger than a union of 2 souls. His father gave a speech that was less about love and more about the continuation of the brand. I smiled and nodded, feeling like a prize broodmare being paraded before the investors. Our life was beautiful on the surface. We lived in a sprawling house in a gated community, a gilded cage I slowly began to realize had no key. David was generous with money but stingy with affection. Everything was conditional. Every gift, every compliment was part of a transaction. He was investing in me, and he expected a very specific return on that investment. NTHE pressure started almost immediately. "My father had to wait years for a son," he'd say, tracing the rim of his wineglass. "I'm not going to make the same mistake. We need a daughter first. Get the girl out of the way, then we can focus on the heir." The casual cruelty of his words chilled me. He spoke of our future children as if they were items on a shopping list. When I became pregnant with our first child, he was ecstatic. He bought designer baby clothes, all in shades of pink and lavender. He designed a nursery that looked like a princess's boudoir. He was already planning her debutante ball, her marriage to a suitable heir from another wealthy family. He wasn't excited for a child. He was excited for a strategic asset. When the ultrasound technician cheerfully announced, "It's a boy," the smile slid from David's face. I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated joy. A son! A beautiful, healthy boy. But David's reaction was muted. "A boy first?" he said in the car on the way home, his voice tight. "That's not the plan. It complicates the inheritance." And our son, Leo, was a beautiful baby. I fell in love instantly. David, however, treated him with a strange detachment. He provided for him, of course, but there was no warmth, no fatherly pride. He looked at Leo as if he were a miscalculation on a balance sheet. The dynasty, he explained to me one night, required a daughter first, to be married off to forge alliances. A firstborn son would think he was the heir, which would make managing him difficult. I stared at him, horrified. We were talking about our child, not a character in a medieval drama. NTWO years later, I was pregnant again. "It has to be a girl this time, Clara," David stated, not as a hope, but as a command. "We have to get the timeline back on track." He hired specialists, consulted with geneticists, and had me on a strict regimen of diets and supplements, rumored to increase the chances of conceiving a girl. I felt like a science experiment, my body no longer my own. When our second son, Max, was born, David didn't even come to the hospital until the next day. He stood in the doorway, looked at the baby in my arms, and said, "This is a problem." The gilded cage was starting to feel like a prison. The silence in our big, empty house was deafening. David spent more and more time at the office or networking, leaving me alone with our two perfect, beautiful sons. The two boys he saw as liabilities. An NTHE third pregnancy was an accident. A moment of carelessness that filled me with a secret, hopeful joy, and David with a cold, calculating dread. When I told him, he didn't yell. He went unnervingly calm. He sat me down in his leather-bound study, a room that always smelled of money and control, and laid out his plan. "This is our last chance to get it right, Clara," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "We cannot have another boy. The family legacy, my father's trust, it all depends on a female heir." That's when he told me about the procedure. An experimental and highly illegal form of in vitro fertilization combined with genetic selection that was being offered by a discreet clinic overseas. It was astronomically expensive and ethically dubious, but it guaranteed a daughter. "We'll tell everyone it was a high-risk pregnancy," he said, his eyes gleaming with a feverish light. "We'll create a story. But we are going to have a daughter," I refused. The thought of it made my skin crawl. I loved my sons more than life itself, and the idea of choosing the gender of my child felt like a monstrous betrayal of that love. My refusal was the first time I had ever truly defied him. The change in him was terrifying. The charming, charismatic man I had met disappeared completely, replaced by a cold, menacing stranger. The emotional manipulation escalated into something darker. He would talk about what a disappointment I was, how I was actively trying to ruin his life. He would remind me of the prenuptial agreement I had signed without a second thought, a document that left me with absolutely nothing if our marriage failed. "You came into this with nothing, Clara," he would say, his voice soft and dangerous. "Don't make the mistake of thinking you can leave with anything. Not even the boys." NTHE threat hung in the air, unspoken but clear. He would use his money and his family's influence to take my children from me. He would paint me as an unstable, unfit mother. I was trapped. The fear he instilled in me was a constant, bitter taste in my mouth. I felt myself shrinking, becoming a ghost in my own home. My only solace was my 2 sons, their innocent laughter, a painful reminder of what I stood to lose. And then came the first ultrasound. I went alone, unable to bear David's suffocating presence. The technician, a kind woman named Maria, moved the wand over my belly. She was quiet for a long time, her brow furrowed. "Well," she said finally, a slow smile spreading across her face. "I see why you're so big. There's quite a crowd in there." My heart stopped. "Crowd?" I whispered. "Mrs. Anderson," she said, her eyes wide with disbelief, "I'm counting 9. You're pregnant with non-uplets. 9 babies." The number was so immense, so impossible, that I couldn't process it. It felt like a dream, a fantasy. Then Maria spoke the words that sealed my fate. "And from what I can see, the chromosomal markers are all the same. They're all boys. 9 more sons." The room began to spin. This wasn't a blessing. In David's world, this was the ultimate curse. This was a declaration of war. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that he would not just be angry. He would be vengeful. He would see this as a deliberate act of defiance, a personal attack on his entire existence. And I made a decision in that sterile, quiet room. A desperate, reckless gamble, born of fear and a fierce, protective love for the 11 lives that now depended on me. I didn't tell him. I couldn't. I went home and lied. I told him the ultrasound was inconclusive, that it was too early to tell the gender or even the number. I let him cling to his desperate hope for a daughter. His hope was the only shield I had, the only thing keeping his rage at bay. I lived a lie for weeks, my gigantic belly a constant, ticking time bomb. I became a prisoner in my own home, placed on strict bed rest. David watched me like a hawk, his mood swinging wildly between anxious hope and simmering suspicion. The house, once silent, was now filled with a palpable tension, the air thick with unspoken threats and the terrifying weight of my secret. I was playing a dangerous game, and I knew with every fiber of my being that I was about to lose. An end came not with a bang, but with a whisper. A whisper from David's sister, Amelia. She was the only one in his family who had ever shown me genuine kindness, a woman trapped in the same toxic system, but who hadn't let it poison her completely. She called me one afternoon, her voice strained. "Clara, I heard David talking to my father," she said, her words rushed. "He's hired a private investigator. He's been tracking your doctor's appointments. He knows you're lying about something. He thinks you're trying to hide a daughter from him, to keep her for yourself. He's unhinged. Please be careful." Blood drained from my face. The walls of my gilded cage were closing in. He knew. He didn't know the whole truth, but he knew I was deceiving him. The lie that had been my shield was about to become his sword. That evening, he came home earlier than usual. He didn't say a word. He just walked into the bedroom where I was confined to bed and placed a thin manila folder on the nightstand. It had my doctor's name on it. "I know you've been lying to me, Clara," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "Tomorrow, we are going to the doctor together, and we are going to get the truth. And if you have done anything to jeopardize the future of this family, I will make you regret the day you were born." Left the room, closing the door softly behind him. The quiet click of the latch was the loudest sound I had ever heard. Panic, cold and absolute, seized me. He was going to find out. He would discover the 9 sons I was carrying, and his rage would be biblical. The threat to take Leo and Max would become a reality. He would destroy me. I had to run. Decision was instantaneous, a primal instinct to protect my young. I waited until I heard his car leave the driveway an hour later, probably heading to his father's to plot his next move. With a surge of adrenaline, I heaved my massive body out of the bed. Every movement was agony. My ankles were swollen. My back screamed in protest, but the terror propelled me forward. I scribbled a quick note to my boys, who were with their nanny, telling them I loved them and I would be back for them. It was a promise I wasn't sure I could keep, and I grabbed the emergency bag I had secretly packed weeks ago, a small duffel with some cash, a burner phone, and a few sentimental items. I couldn't take a car. He would track it. The train station was 5 miles away. It might as well have been 100. I waddled down the long, manicured driveway of our sterile mansion, each step a monumental effort. I was a ship breaking apart, a vessel carrying a precious cargo, trying to outrun a hurricane, and I made it 2 blocks before the first contraction hit me. It was sharp, violent, and utterly unexpected. I wasn't due for another 6 weeks. The stress, the fear, it had triggered early labor. I cried out, stumbling against a mailbox for support. Another contraction followed, stronger this time, doubling me over. I was having these babies, here, now, on a quiet suburban street in the middle of the night. My water broke in a warm gush, and I collapsed onto the cold, damp grass of a stranger's lawn. The pain was blinding, all-consuming. I fumbled for the burner phone, my fingers shaking uncontrollably. I managed to dial 911, my voice a choked sob. My babies, they're coming. 9 of them. I don't know if they understood me. The world was narrowing to a tunnel of agony. I felt an overwhelming, primal urge to push. And then, under the cold, indifferent light of a street lamp, my first son was born. Then the second. One after another, they arrived, a terrifying, miraculous flood. I was screaming, sobbing, trying to keep them warm, trying to keep them alive. That's when the headlights washed over me. A sleek, black sedan pulled up to the curb. The door opened, and David got out. He must have seen my escape on the security cameras. He walked towards me, his face unreadable in the harsh glare. For a fleeting, insane moment, I felt a surge of relief. He was here. He would help. "David," I cried, my voice raw, "thank God. Help me." NHE stopped a few feet away, his expensive shoes on the edge of the damp grass. He looked down at the scene, at me, broken and bleeding, at the tiny, writhing bodies surrounding me. His eyes scanned the chaos, and I saw him counting. 1, 2, 3, all the way to 9. The hope in his face curdled into disbelief, then into a grotesque mask of pure hatred. This was his nightmare made real. The ultimate failure. The ultimate curse. He looked at me, his wife, the mother of his 11 sons, and he spat on the ground. "You," he whispered, the word a blade of ice. "You did this to me." Then he turned, got back in his car, and drove away, leaving us all to die in the dark, an NTHE world dissolved into a symphony of sirens. Red and blue lights painted the trees, turning the quiet suburban street into a chaotic stage. I remember faces looming over me, voices shouting medical terms that meant nothing. I was a problem to be solved, a body to be stabilized. But my only thought, my only prayer, was for the tiny lives scattered around me on the cold grass. My sons, I remember gasping, over and over, "Save my sons." They swarmed the scene like angels of mercy, a paramedic for every baby, it seemed. Tiny oxygen masks, thermal blankets, a flurry of life-saving motion. I saw them working on the smallest one, a boy who had been terrifyingly still. A paramedic was performing CPR with 2 fingers on his impossibly small chest. "Breathe, little man, breathe," he murmured, his voice a desperate prayer. And as they loaded me into an ambulance, the world tilted and went dark. My last conscious thought was a horrifying one. Had they found them all? In the darkness, in the chaos, had one of my boys been missed? The thought was a shard of glass in my heart before unconsciousness claimed me. I woke up in the sterile white world of the ICU. A doctor with kind eyes and a weary face stood by my bed. "Clara," she said gently, "you're a very lucky woman. You lost a lot of blood. We had to perform an emergency hysterectomy, but you're going to make it." The words barely registered. "My babies," I rasped, my throat raw. "Are they?" NHER expression softened with a deep, profound compassion. "8 of your sons survived the night," she said. "They are incredibly small, and they have a long fight ahead of them in the NICU. But they are fighters, every single one. 8. The word was both a miracle and a death sentence. A wave of relief so powerful it felt like grief crashed over me. 8 were alive. But one, the little one I had seen them working on, he hadn't made it. He had died before I ever had the chance to hold him, to name him. A sob tore from my throat, a raw, animal sound of loss. And it was David's fault. He had murdered our son as surely as if he had used his own hands. NTHE doctor, let me weep, her hand a comforting weight on my arm. When the storm of my grief subsided, she spoke again, her voice firm. "Clara, the police are here. They need a statement. They found your husband." A cold, hard rage, pure and clean as ice, cut through my sorrow. It burned away the tears. "Good," I whispered. "Where is he?" "They found him at his father's estate," she replied, her voice laced with contempt. "He was in a meeting with his legal team, drafting a motion to file for sole custody of your 2 older sons, claiming you were mentally unstable and had run away. NTHE audacity of it, the sheer calculated cruelty, left me breathless. He hadn't just left us to die. He had already moved on to the next phase of his war, to erase me completely and claim the only 2 children he still considered assets. My recovery was a blur of pain, grief, and a growing, steely resolve. The hospital became my world. The NICU became my church. I would sit for hours in a wheelchair between the rows of incubators, my 8 tiny sons hooked up to a symphony of beeping machines. I gave them names of strength: Phoenix, Griffin, Titan, Hunter, Archer, Jet, Rocco, and Stone. I would reach my hand into their plastic wombs and touch their fragile skin, pouring all my love, all my will to live, into them. While I was fighting for my sons' lives, the story exploded. Banker's wife gives birth on lawn, husband flees. The initial reports painted David as a monster. But then the narrative began to shift, twisted by the power and influence of his family. Whispers turned into headlines. Troubled mother abandons home. Husband distraught over wife's erratic behavior. They were painting me as a hysterical, negligent woman who had endangered her own children. They were using my lie, the lie I told to protect myself, as proof of my instability. David was never arrested. His lawyers argued he had left the scene in a state of shock and emotional distress to seek counsel, and that he had no idea I was in labor. It was a disgusting, transparent lie, but in a world greased by money, it was enough. I was served with a restraining order, barring me from my own home. Worse, a family court judge, a friend of David's father, granted him temporary emergency custody of Leo and Max. He had taken everything: my home, my health, one of my children, and now the other 2. I was left with nothing but a hospital gown and a room paid for by charity care. One night, a nurse named Maria, the same woman from the ultrasound room, came to see me after her shift. She had followed the story, her face etched with fury. "This is wrong," she said, pressing a folded piece of paper into my hand. "Don't let him win." It was the name and number of a lawyer. "Her name is Evelyn Reed," Maria whispered. "She's not fancy. She doesn't work out of a high-rise. But she eats men like your husband for breakfast. She's a fighter, just like you." That piece of paper was a lifeline. It was the first stone in the foundation of my new life. He thought he had left me with nothing. He didn't realize he had left me with the one thing more powerful than his money: a mother's rage. Evelyn Reed's office was in a rundown building above a laundromat, the air thick with the smell of bleach and determination. The room was cluttered with stacks of files, each one representing a life upended, a battle fought. Evelyn herself was a woman in her late 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing, and a handshake that could crush stone. She looked less like a lawyer and more like a general preparing for war. NSHE listened to my entire story without interruption, her expression unreadable. I told her everything: the obsession with the daughter, the threats, the illegal IVF clinic, the lie I told, the folder on my nightstand, the escape, and the final, brutal abandonment. When I finished, my voice hoarse, she leaned back in her creaky chair and stared at me for a long moment. "He's built a fortress of lies around himself," she said, her voice a low growl. "A fortress made of money, influence, and public opinion. A frontal assault is suicide. We can't just knock on the door. We have to tear it down from the inside out." Neville's strategy was not one of defense, but of relentless, methodical attack. "The family court is compromised," she stated flatly. "His father owns that judge. We're not fighting for custody there, not yet. We're fighting a different war. We are going to sue him in civil court for damages so vast it will make his father's fortune tremble. And we are going to leak every single piece of filth we find to the press until his reputation is nothing but a pile of ash." NSHE became my drill sergeant. My job, she said, was to get stronger, to get my sons healthy, and to be the face of righteous fury. Her job was to forge the sword I would wield. Her team, a small group of hungry, brilliant young investigators, began to dig. They were relentless. They found the private investigator David had hired. They tracked down the overseas clinic and found a disgruntled former nurse willing to talk. They subpoenaed David's phone records, which showed a flurry of calls to his father and his lawyers that night, but not a single one to 911. Meanwhile, I focused on my sons. The hospital social worker, seeing my plight, connected me with a national charity that helped victims of domestic abuse. They were outraged by my story. They moved me from the hospital into a small, secure apartment, a safe house where David couldn't find me. Volunteers brought cribs, diapers, and formula. The kindness of strangers was a balm on my raw wounds. One by one, my 8 tiny warriors grew strong enough to come home. My small apartment became a chaotic, beautiful symphony of life. It was exhausting, relentless work, but every time I held one of my sons, I felt my resolve harden. I was not just fighting for myself, I was fighting for them, for Leo and Max, trapped in that cold mansion, and for the son I had named Adam, the first man, the one I had lost. NTHE, first strike, came 3 months later. Evelyn filed the civil suit. The numbers were staggering, citing intentional infliction of emotional distress, child endangerment, and wrongful death. The lawsuit was a work of art, detailing every threat, every manipulation, every cruel act. Evelyn then accidentally leaked it to a hungry online journalist who was known for taking down powerful men. NTHE's story went viral. The narrative began to shift. The whispers about the unstable mother were drowned out by a roar of outrage against the millionaire monster. The details about his obsession with a daughter, his demand for illegal genetic selection, and his call to his lawyer instead of an ambulance painted a picture so vile it was impossible to ignore. NTHE's second strike was a personal one. Evelyn found Amelia, David's sister. She was terrified of her father and brother, but her conscience was eating her alive. Evelyn met with her in secret, appealing not to her sense of justice, but to her love for Leo and Max. "You know what he is," Evelyn told her. "You know those boys are not safe with him. You can be the one who saves them." It was a gamble, but it paid off. Amelia agreed to testify. She would corroborate the story of the family's toxic obsession with heirs, David's escalating rage, and the phone call she had made to me, warning me that he knew I was lying. She was our inside source, the key to unlocking the fortress. The sword was forged. It was sharp, it was heavy, and I was finally ready to wield it. NTHE's civil trial was a media circus. David and his father arrived each day in a storm of camera flashes, their faces grim masks of arrogance. They thought it was a game they could win, a problem money could solve. They underestimated Evelyn. They underestimated me. Nevelyn orchestrated the trial like a master composer. She started with the paramedics who had been at the scene, their testimony painting a harrowing picture of a mother's worst nightmare. They spoke of my desperate pleas to save my sons and the chilling absence of my husband. Then came the disgruntled nurse from the overseas clinic, her video deposition detailing David's cold inquiries about guaranteeing a female product. The jury, a mix of working-class men and women, listened with growing disgust. NMY testimony was the heart of the case. Evelyn had coached me for weeks. No tears, she had instructed. Just cold, hard truth. Let them see the steel in your spine. I walked to the stand, made eye contact with the jury, and I told them everything. I spoke of my love for my sons and of David's disappointment in them. I spoke of his threats, his control, and the final, ultimate act of abandonment. When his lawyer cross-examined me, trying to paint me as a liar and a hysteric, I met his questions with calm, factual answers. Yes, I lied to my husband, I said, my voice clear and steady. I lied because I was terrified he would harm me and my unborn children. My only regret is that I didn't run sooner. NTHE turning point, the moment the fortress truly began to crumble, was Amelia's testimony. She walked into the courtroom, refusing to look at her father and brother. In a quiet, trembling voice, she corroborated everything. She spoke of the decades of misogynistic poison fed to them by their father. She described David's rage, his obsession, and the chilling phone call she made to me. David's father stared at her, his face purple with rage, a king watching his own daughter betray the crown. NTHE final blow came from David himself. Evelyn put him on the stand. He was smug, confident, clearly coached by his high-priced legal team. He stuck to his story. He was in shock. He was distraught. He panicked. Evelyn let him talk, letting him dig his own grave. Then, she produced the phone records. "And Mr. Anderson," she said, her voice deceptively gentle, "these records show that in the 30 minutes after you drove away from your dying wife and 9 newborn children, you made 7 phone calls. Is that correct?" "I was in shock," he repeated, his voice faltering slightly. "I was reaching out for help." "Were you?" Evelyn's voice turned to ice. "Your first call was to your father. Your second was to your lead counsel. Your third was to your family's public relations firm. Not one of these calls was to 911. You didn't call for an ambulance, Mr. Anderson. You called for an army to protect your reputation, not to save your family. Tell me," she leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his, "in your state of shock, did you happen to remember the number for your lawyer, but forget the 3 simplest digits in the world to save a life?" NTHE courtroom was silent. David stared at her, his mask of confidence shattering, revealing the hollow, pathetic man beneath. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was broken. NTHE jury's verdict was swift and brutal. They found him liable on all counts. The financial damages they awarded were astronomical, a figure so large it was designed not just to compensate, but to punish, to dismantle an empire. The judgment effectively froze the family's assets, plunging them into a legal and financial nightmare. NTHE fallout was immediate. The story was everywhere. The verdict, a public condemnation. David's father's business partners began to pull out. His social circle shunned him. The House of Anderson, built on a foundation of arrogance and cruelty, was collapsing in on itself. The family court judge, now under intense media scrutiny for his connection to the family, recused himself from my custody case. A new, impartial judge immediately reversed the emergency order, and I was granted sole custody of Leo and Max. The day I went to that cold mansion to bring my boys home, David was nowhere to be seen. It was just me, my 2 oldest sons, and the sweet, sweet sound of freedom. NTHE years that followed were not easy, but they were ours. The money from the settlement wasn't a windfall. It was a tool. It allowed me to buy a sprawling, slightly ramshackle house in a quiet town far away from the city's glare. A house with a big backyard, strong trees for climbing, and enough room for 10 boys to grow. It wasn't a mansion, but it was a home, filled with the chaotic, beautiful noise of a life fully lived. And I was no longer just a mother. I was the fierce matriarch of a sprawling, loving clan. Leo and Max, free from the suffocating weight of their father's expectations, blossomed. They were incredible big brothers, patient and protective of the 8 little cyclones who idolized them. My days were a blur of scraped knees, science projects, muddy cleats, and endless laughter. My 8 little warriors grew into 8 distinct, wonderful young men. Phoenix, the quiet artist; Griffin, the natural leader; Titan, the gentle giant. Each one a testament to the miracle of survival. NWE built a life not on a legacy of wealth, but on a foundation of kindness, respect, and unconditional love. I went back to school, got my degree, and became an art therapist, helping children navigate trauma. My work was my calling, a way to pay forward the kindness that had been shown to me. David and his father were ruined. The legal battles drained their fortune, and the public disgrace shattered their empire. I heard through the grapevine that David lived a quiet, solitary life, a ghost haunted by the dynasty he had destroyed. I never felt a shred of pity for him. He wasn't a tragic figure. He was a man who had made his choices. He had been given a treasure beyond measure, and he had thrown it away because it wasn't the shape he wanted. One warm summer evening, I was sitting on the back porch, watching my sons play a chaotic game of soccer in the yard. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over everything. Leo, now a tall, handsome 18-year-old with my quiet eyes and a kind smile, came and sat beside me. "And Mom," he said, his voice filled with the gentle gravity of a young man on the cusp of his own life. "I was reading some old articles online today about him. He didn't have to say the name. I don't understand. How could he look at all of this?" He gestured to the yard, to his 9 brothers, "and see a curse?" And I watched them for a moment. I watched Phoenix help his smallest brother, Stone, tie his shoe. I watched Titan give his twin, Griffin, a piggyback ride after he fell. I listened to the symphony of their shouts and laughter, the soundtrack of my life. I turned to my firstborn son, my heart swelling with a love so vast it felt infinite. "Because, my love," I said softly, "some people spend their whole lives looking for treasure, and they wouldn't recognize it if they were drowning in it." He thought he was building a kingdom, but he didn't understand that a family isn't a fortress. It's a garden. Leo looked out at the yard, at the 9 other boys who were his world, and a slow smile spread across his face. "A garden of boys," he said. "The best kind," I replied, pulling him into a hug. He had left me on the cold ground, surrounded by what he called a curse. He thought he was leaving me to die in the darkness, but he was wrong. He had left me in a field of miracles, and I had spent the rest of my life watching them grow.